The silver fork clattered against the fine bone china, a sound like a gunshot in the hushed, velvet atmosphere of the restaurant. Across the table, my ex-husband Mark stood frozen with a bottle of vintage Bordeaux in his trembling hand, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost under the soft amber glow of the chandelier. He was dressed in a waiter's waistcoat, staring at me, the woman he had left for dead emotionally and financially 3 years ago, now sitting at the head of a table full of investors who hung on my every word. But the true poison wasn't in his gaze. It was in the way my sister, Elena, who was supposed to be my guest of honor, didn't look surprised at all, her fingers brushing his sleeve in a secret, practiced gesture of comfort that told me the betrayal I'd survived years ago had never actually ended. To understand how I ended up at that table and how Mark ended up holding a tray, you have to go back to the days when my life smelled like cheap detergent and overpriced ambition. 5 years ago, my world was small, cozy, and, I believed, unshakable. I was married to Mark, a man with a smile that could melt the coldest heart and a work ethic that was, in hindsight, suspiciously non-existent. We lived in a small, sun-drenched apartment on the edge of the city, a place filled with the scent of fresh jasmine from the balcony and the sound of jazz playing softly in the background while I worked late into the night. I was the breadwinner, a role I took on with pride rather than resentment. I had inherited a small, struggling architectural firm from my grandmother, a woman who built skyscrapers when women weren't even allowed to wear trousers on a construction site. It was my heart, my soul, and my only real asset. I spent my days drafting blueprints and my nights balancing the books, while Mark found himself. He was always on the verge of a big break, a startup idea, or a consulting gig that never quite materialized. "Don't worry, Maya," he would say, sneaking up behind me and kissing the nape of my neck as I hunched over a drawing board. "Once my project takes off, you'll never have to look at a budget again. We'll travel the world, just you and me." "I don't mind the work, Mark," I'd reply, leaning back into his warmth. "I just want us to be stable. I want to know the firm is safe." He would nod, his eyes dark and soulful. "It's safe. I'm here, aren't I?" At the time, my sister Elena was my closest confidant. She was 3 years younger, a whirlwind of blonde hair and organized chaos, who worked as a freelance marketing assistant. She was always over at our place, raiding the fridge and complaining about her latest string of bad dates. She seemed to adore Mark, often joking that she was looking for a clone of him for herself. "You're so lucky, Maya," she'd sigh, sipping a glass of wine on our velvet sofa. "Mark is so supportive. Most guys would be intimidated by a woman running her own company, but he just wants to see you shine." I believed her. I believed both of them. My life was a series of comfortable rituals, the Saturday morning trips to the farmer's market, the way Mark would always bring me a cup of Earl Grey at 4 p.m. precisely, and the feeling that we were a team against the world. But there were shadows I chose to ignore, small things, like the way Mark would suddenly turn his phone screen down when I walked into the room, or how Elena always seemed to know about our private arguments before I even had a chance to tell her. There was also the matter of my grandmother's trust fund, a significant sum of money tied to the firm that was meant to be a safety net for extreme emergencies only. I remember one rainy Tuesday, the smell of damp pavement drifting through the window, when Mark sat me down with a look of grave concern. "Maya, honey, I was looking at the quarterly projections for the firm," he started, his voice hushed. He had taken it upon himself to help with the administrative side of things so I could focus on design. "The overhead is killing us. If we don't infuse some capital, we might lose the big contract for the waterfront development." I felt a cold prickle of anxiety. "What are you saying, Mark? We have the reserves." "We used most of those for the new software licenses, remember?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. I think we might need to tap into the trust, just a little bit, to bridge the gap." I hesitated. That money was sacred. "Mark, that's for a catastrophe. Are things really that bad?" "I wouldn't suggest it if they weren't," he said, taking my hands in his. His palms were warm, steady. "I've already talked to Elena's friend who's a financial advisor. He says it's the smartest move to protect the business. I just want to protect your legacy, Maya." I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but devotion. I didn't see the predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't see the way his fingers twitched with a greed he'd been hiding for years. I just saw my husband, the man I loved, offering me a lifeline. "Okay," I whispered, "but just what we need, not a penny more." "Of course," he smiled, and for a moment, the sun broke through the clouds outside, casting a golden light across our living room. It felt like a blessing. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. Within 6 months, the trust would be empty, the firm would be in foreclosure, and Mark would be gone, leaving behind nothing but a typed note and a shattered heart. But sitting in that 5-star restaurant 3 years later, wearing a silk suit that cost more than my old car, and holding the power to make or break careers, I realized the emergency had been a lie, and the lifeline had been the noose he used to hang my career. And seeing Elena's hand on his arm, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't been my confidant. She had been his accomplice. The weeks following my decision to tap into the trust fund felt like walking through a thick, cloying fog. On the surface, Mark was more attentive than ever. He brought me flowers for no reason, dark red roses that seemed to bleed into the crystal vase on my desk. He took over all the tedious communication with the bank, claiming he wanted to spare me the stress while I worked on the waterfront project. But the air in our home had changed. It felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the rooms one by one. I started noticing small, jagged cracks in the foundation of our life. It began with the mail. For years, I had been the one to collect the heavy stack of envelopes from the brass slot in the door. Suddenly, Mark was always there first. If I reached for the mail, he'd gently intercept me, his hand firm on my wrist. "I've got it, Maya. You've got enough on your plate. Go back to your sketches," he'd say, his voice smooth as silk, but his eyes never quite met mine. Then there were the late-night whispered phone calls. I'd wake up at 2 a.m., the bed cold beside me, and hear his low murmur coming from the kitchen. When I'd creep down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my weight, he'd hang up abruptly. "Just work stuff, honey," he'd say, leaning against the counter and sipping water in the dark. "The investors are in a different time zone. Go back to sleep." Elena was around constantly, too. She had become a fixture in our living room, always huddled with Mark over his laptop, their heads close together. When I walked in, they'd spring apart like guilty teenagers. "Just helping Mark with his new branding," she'd chirp, though her eyes looked darting and anxious. "You know how he is with color palettes, Maya. He needs a professional eye." I wanted to believe her. I needed to, but my gut was screaming. One afternoon, I came home early because a meeting had been canceled. The house was silent, but the scent of Elena's heavy vanilla perfume hung in the hallway. I found them in my home office. Mark was sitting in my chair, my grandmother's chair, and Elena was standing over him, pointing at a document on the screen. "Wait," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. "Why are you two looking at the firm's payroll?" Mark didn't flinch. He just looked up and smiled, that slow, practiced smile that I used to find so comforting. "Oh, Maya, you're home early. We were just looking for ways to trim the fat. Elena's found some redundant administrative costs. We're trying to save you money, remember?" "I handle the payroll, Mark. I always have." "And you're exhausted," Elena interjected, stepping toward me and placing a hand on my shoulder. Her palm felt cold. "You're making mistakes, Maya. We found 3 discrepancies in the last month alone. We're just trying to fix things before the bank notices." I felt a surge of shame. Was I that tired? Was I failing the legacy my grandmother left me? I let them usher me out of my own office, feeling like a guest in my own life. The turning point, the moment the floor finally gave way, happened on a Tuesday. It was a day that smelled of ozone and impending rain. I was looking for my passport in the bottom drawer of the antique filing cabinet in our bedroom, a drawer Mark had told me was broken weeks ago. I'd used a screwdriver to pry it open, expecting to find a jammed track. Instead, I found a black leather portfolio I'd never seen before. My heart began to thud against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm. I sat on the floor, the cold wood pressing against my thighs, and opened it. The first thing I saw was a letter from the bank. It wasn't about a loan, it was a notice of final transfer. I flipped the page. My breath hitched. There were 3 separate wire transfers, totaling nearly the entire amount of my grandmother's trust fund, moved into an offshore account I didn't recognize. But it wasn't the theft that broke me. It was the name on the account. It wasn't just Mark's name, it was a joint account, Mark and Elena Henderson. My sister had taken his last name on a secret account while I was upstairs sleeping. The room began to spin. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean my head against the cool metal of the cabinet. My hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled like dry leaves. I turned the page again and found a draft of a legal document, an agreement for voluntary transfer of assets. It was a contract that would hand over the deed of my firm to a shell company owned by the 2 of them. It was dated for the following week. I heard the front door click open. The familiar sound of Mark's whistle echoed through the house, followed by Elena's high-pitched laugh. "Maya, you home?" Mark called out, his voice light and airy. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, the documents clutched to my chest. The betrayal wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow-acting poison they had been feeding me for months. They hadn't just wanted the money. They wanted to strip me of my identity, my business, and my home. "Maya?" Mark's footsteps were on the stairs now, heavy, confident. I looked down at the signature line on the final document. Mark had already signed it. Elena had signed it. They were just waiting for me to be tired enough, confused enough, to sign the last piece of paper they'd put in front of me under the guise of saving the firm. The bedroom door pushed open. Mark stood there, his coat still on, a bag of groceries in his hand. He saw the drawer. He saw the portfolio in my hands. For a split second, his mask slipped. The supportive husband vanished, and in his place was a man with eyes as hard and cold as flint. He didn't look remorseful. He looked annoyed. "You shouldn't have opened that, Maya," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its warmth. "We were going to handle this quietly. We were going to make sure you were taken care of." "Taken care of?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "You stole my grandmother's money, you and my sister." Elena appeared in the doorway behind him, her face pale, but her jaw set in a hard, defiant line. "It's not stealing, Maya. You were sinking the business. We're just restructuring. You don't have the stomach for what needs to be done. We do." The pulse in my ears was so loud, it drowned out the sound of the rain starting to lash against the window. I looked at the 2 people I loved most in the world and realized I was looking at strangers. The woman I'd shared a childhood with and the man I'd shared a bed with were vultures, waiting for me to stop breathing so they could pick my bones clean. "Get out," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. Mark stepped into the room, closing the door behind Elena. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me with a chilling clinical pity. "We're not going anywhere, Maya. In fact, we need to talk about that signature, because if you don't sign that transfer today, I'm going to tell the board that you've been embezzling from the trust yourself. I've spent months setting up the paper trail. Who do you think they'll believe? The grieving, unstable CEO? Or the husband who tried to save her?" Mark's words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating shroud. He sat there on our duvet, the very fabric I had picked out for our 2nd anniversary, and calmly explained how he had dismantled my life. He wasn't the man I had married. He was a stranger wearing my husband's skin, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once been my sanctuary. "Embezzling?" I whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You did this. You moved the money." "I moved the money to protect it from your instability, Maya," Mark said, tilting his head with a terrifying, clinical detachment. "Every time you were tired or stressed, I made sure to log it. I've kept a diary of your erratic behavior. I've even had a few conversations with your lead architect about how worried I am that you're losing your grip on reality. By the time I'm done, no court in the country will take your word over mine." Elena stepped further into the room, leaning against the doorframe. She looked at me not with guilt, but with a sharp, hungry triumph. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Maya. You've always had everything, the business, the house, the perfect reputation. It's time you shared. Mark and we're a better team anyway. We see the potential in that land that you were too ethical to exploit." The waterfront project. I realized then that they weren't just after the trust fund. They had already made a side deal with a predatory developer I had turned down months ago. They were going to sell my grandmother's legacy to the highest bidder and turn it into a strip of soulless high-rises. "You're sleeping with him," I said, the realization hitting me with a cold, sickening clarity. The secret phone calls, the smell of her perfume in the hallway, the way they looked at each other. It wasn't just a financial coup, it was a total replacement. Elena didn't even flinch. She smiled, a slow, cruel curve of her lips. "Mark deserves someone who isn't married to her drawing board, Maya. Someone who actually appreciates the lifestyle he wants to build. You were always too busy saving the world, one blueprint at a time, to notice what he actually needed." "And what did he need, Elena?" I snapped, my voice finally finding its edge. "A thief for a partner? A liar for a mistress?" Mark stood up, his height suddenly intimidating in the small room. He walked toward me, and for a second, I thought he might actually strike me. Instead, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so familiar, so intimate, that it made my skin crawl. "I needed a future, Maya, and you were just the ladder I used to climb toward it. Now, sign the transfer. We've already drafted a public statement saying you're stepping down for health reasons. You get a small monthly stipend, we get the firm, and nobody goes to jail. It's a clean break." "And if I don't?" Mark's face hardened, the last vestige of the man I knew vanishing. "Then the police get the evidence of the embezzlement tomorrow morning. I've already planted the digital trail on your personal laptop. It looks like you've been funneling money into a private account for years. You'll lose the firm, the house, and your freedom. Choose wisely." He dropped a heavy silver fountain pen onto the portfolio in my lap. The metal clinked against the leather, a sound that felt like a gavel coming down. I looked at them both, my sister, the person who shared my blood, and my husband, the person who had promised to protect it. They stood side by side, a united front of greed and betrayal. I felt a wave of such intense, visceral heat that I thought I might burst into flames. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my teeth. "I need time," I managed to choke out. "You have until tomorrow morning," Mark said, checking his watch, the watch I had bought him for his birthday. "We'll be staying at Elena's place tonight. I suggest you pack a bag too. This house is part of the restructuring, Maya. It's already been listed." They walked out together, their shoulders brushing as they navigated the narrow hallway. I heard the front door click shut, the sound echoing through the empty house. I sat on the floor of my bedroom for a long time, the portfolio still clutched in my hands, surrounded by the wreckage of a life I thought was real. The rain was pouring now, a relentless gray curtain against the window. I felt small. I felt defeated. I felt like a fool who had invited the wolves into the fold and fed them from my own hand. But then, my eyes fell on the documents again. I looked at the joint account name, Mark and Elena Henderson. Henderson. Elena's last name was Vance. My last name was Vance. I leaned closer, my eyes narrowing. If they had opened a joint account under the name Henderson, they must have already married in some jurisdiction, or were planning to. But wait. I looked at the date on the bank statement. It was from 4 months ago. A cold, sharp logic began to cut through my grief. If they had been operating as a married couple 4 months ago, while Mark was still legally married to me, they hadn't just committed theft, they had committed bigamy, or, at the very least, fraud in their banking applications. And then I saw it, a small yellow receipt tucked into the very back of the portfolio, something Mark must have missed when he was gloating. It was a receipt for a private storage unit on the other side of town. My hands stopped shaking. The heat in my chest didn't go away, but it changed. It went from a chaotic, burning panic to a steady, icy resolve. I didn't reach for the pen to sign their documents. Instead, I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over a contact I hadn't called in years. Sarah, my grandmother's old corporate lawyer, the woman Mark had convinced me was too expensive and out of touch. "Sarah?" I said when she picked up, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "It's Maya. I need you, and I need you to bring a private investigator who doesn't mind working in the rain." I looked at the silver pen on the floor. Mark thought he had built a ladder out of my life. He didn't realize that I was the one who designed the foundation, and I knew exactly which stone to pull to make the whole thing come crashing down on their heads. The confrontation wasn't over. It had just moved from the bedroom to the battlefield, and for the first time in months, I wasn't the tired wife. I was the architect. The transformation didn't happen with a scream. It happened with a click. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, an internal shift where the warmth of my love for Mark and Elena froze into a solid, jagged block of ice. I stood up from the floor, my legs no longer shaking. I didn't see my husband and sister anymore. I saw two poorly designed structures with crumbling foundations, and I was the only architect in the room who knew how to bring them down. That night, while the rain hammered against the roof of the house I was supposedly losing, I didn't pack a suitcase. I packed a briefcase. I spent 6 hours at the kitchen table, the light of my laptop the only glow in the dark house. With Sarah and her private investigator on the line, we began to peel back the layers of Mark's paper trail. He was arrogant, and arrogant men always leave a scent. He had used my own company login to move the funds, but he had done it at 3 a.m. from an IP address linked to a hotel where he and Elena had spent the weekend 3 months ago. The biggest discovery, however, came from the receipt I'd found for the storage unit. At dawn, I drove there through the thinning mist. Inside Unit 402, I didn't find old furniture. I found the original, untampered-with trust documents and a leather-bound journal. Mark, in his narcissism, had recorded every step of his plan, but tucked into the back cover was the killing blow, a marriage certificate from a small island in the Grenadines. Mark and Elena had married a year ago. He hadn't just cheated, he had committed bigamy. Every contract he had signed on my behalf, every bank transfer he had initiated as my legal husband, was now a felony. The 3 years that followed were a blur of depositions, courtrooms, and the slow, grueling work of rebuilding from ash. I lost the house. It was sold to cover the initial debts, but I kept the firm's name and my grandmother's blueprints. I moved into a studio apartment that smelled of dust and old books, and I worked until my fingers bled. Mark and Elena vanished into a web of legal battles, their restructuring plan collapsing as the bank froze the offshore account and the police opened a fraud investigation. And that brings us back to the restaurant. 3 years later, the waterfront project was no longer a dream. It was a reality, and I was the lead architect. I sat at a table for 12, the city's most powerful investors surrounding me. I was wearing a suit of midnight blue silk, my hair pulled back in a sharp, uncompromising blade. When the waiter approached our table to pour the wine, I didn't notice him at first. I was discussing the load-bearing capacity of the new pier. But then, I felt a tremor. The wine bottle clinked against the glass, a drop of dark red spilling onto the white linen. "I'm so sorry," a familiar, raspy voice whispered. I looked up. Mark stood there, his face haggard, the skin around his eyes gray and papery. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting waiter's waistcoat. He looked like a man who had spent every one of those 3 years losing. Beside me, Elena, who had somehow talked her way into a marketing consultant role for one of the junior investors, gasped. She was my guest of honor tonight, only because I had spent 6 months orchestrating this exact seating chart. I wanted her to see me at the summit while she was still crawling in the dirt. Her hand instinctively reached out and brushed Mark's sleeve, a gesture of old, habitual comfort that proved they were still tethered together in their shared misery. The table went silent. My investors looked at the trembling waiter, then at Elena, then at me. "Mark," I said, my voice as calm and cool as a mountain stream, "you missed a spot." Mark's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, his eyes darting from my face to the high society guests who were now looking at him with thinly veiled disgust. This was the man who had tried to convince the world I was unstable. Now, he couldn't even pour a glass of wine without shaking. "Maya," he finally managed to choke out, I didn't know you'd be here." "I know you didn't," I said, leaning back and crossing my legs. "Just like you didn't know that the shell company that bought out your legal debts last month was a subsidiary of my firm. You don't just work for this restaurant, Mark. Technically, you work for me." Elena's face turned a shade of white I'd never seen before. "Maya, please," she hissed, her voice trembling. "We were just trying to get back on our feet. You've already taken everything." "I took nothing," I replied, my voice sharpening into a blade. "I simply reclaimed what you stole. You thought I was the ladder you could use to climb to a better life. You forgot that if you break the ladder while you're standing on it, there's only one way to go." I turned to the head investor, a man who valued loyalty above all else. "I'm sorry for the interruption, Arthur. It's hard to find good help these days, especially when they have a history of bigamy and grand larceny." The silence that followed was absolute. Mark dropped the bottle. It shattered on the floor, the vintage Bordeaux spreading across the tile like a pool of blood. Security was called. As they were let out, Mark stumbling and Elena sobbing about unfairness, I didn't feel a surge of heat. I felt a profound, quiet peace. 6 months later, I sat on the balcony of my new home. It wasn't the old house, but it was mine, built from my own designs, paid for with my own sweat. The scent of fresh jasmine hung in the air, heavy and sweet. I sipped a cup of Earl Grey, watching the sun set over the waterfront project I had fought so hard to protect. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. The final sentencing was in. Mark and Elena would be spending the next several years in a place where the only restructuring they could do was in a prison laundry room. I put the phone down and looked at the blueprints spread out on the table before me. My grandmother used to say that a building is only as strong as the truth of its materials. I had been tested, hammered by betrayal, and scorched by greed. But I hadn't broken. I had simply been forged into something harder. The jazz music played softly in the background, the same tune as years ago, but the air no longer felt thin. I took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling my lungs. I was no longer the woman waiting for a man to save her legacy. I was the legacy. Some people are built to be lived in, and some are built to stand alone against the storm. I finally knew which one I was. And as the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, I realized that the view from the top is much better when you're the one who built the mountain.